Hello and welcome back to Property Insight. My name is Mark Ashworth.
I'm Neil Harding.
And today we're talking about pets in rental properties. So tenants who live in houses that you may own and they now want to have a pet in place, whether it's a cat or dog or fish or bird or whatever it might be. So implications of that, Neil, have changed. So there used to be the fact that you could refuse, but now you're not, what's the wording?
You cannot unreasonably withhold consent should a tenant request permission to have a pet.
Okay.
So, interestingly, a few years ago, the government model tenancy agreement included a clause for the first time, I think this is in 2021, where tenants could have a pet if the landlord agreed. That's not a mandatory clause, so it was optional for landlords to use that, so you could remove that clause. And it still remains at this point in time really that it's upon agreement, so it's a mutual agreement thing. The Renters Reform Bill is really sort of another thing that the Renters Reform Bill has done is throw this whole area under the spotlight, which is probably why we're talking about it and other people are talking about it at the moment. The sort of direction of travel seems to be that there's more emphasis being placed all the time on tenants having, of course, a right to enjoy the property in a tenant-like way, but that part of that, especially in lives in the UK, there's a lot of pet lovers. We're a pet-loving country, so tenants want to have pets. So what does that mean for us as property investors?
I mean, in my opinion, I think if your tenant is looking after the place, they're responsible. I guess there is no issue to allow them to have a pet. That could be that they may have been in the property already for a year or two before they decide to do that. I think initially, if they're asking when they move into the property, then I guess you need to just put a few things in place in order to protect yourself and any potential damage to the property that may be caused, and obviously find out about what type of pet it is, because it could be that if it's a goldfish or, as I say, birds in a cage, that could be not really an issue. If on the other hand it's a big 40 to 50 kilo dog, then that's a different matter, particularly if you're in a leasehold flat on maybe the 7th floor, let's say.
Yeah. So if we think about what might be reasonable grounds for a landlord to say no to a pet, what would we be thinking of, Mark? Because I suppose it can depend on the property, it can depend on the tenant, it can depend on the pet.
So for me, it's about space. If you've got a property, we typically would always ask how many people would be on that tenancy agreement. So if it was a couple, then those two names would be on the tenancy agreement. If they had two children, their names would be listed as to those people who would have the right to occupy the property. So it would be the tenancy agreement holders plus the two children. And if it was, let's say, a 2-bedroom property where the two children may be sharing a room, plus you've got 2 adults in there's an argument to say that perhaps the property isn't big enough to have a dog as well. Also, whether it's got any outdoor amenity space. So typically at night, if you want to let your dog out to do what it needs to do, how practicable is that going to be? And are you going to disrupt neighbours by doing that? And could that be a nuisance to neighbours? And therefore, could it cause an issue later on down the line with an environmental health issue perhaps? So all these things I would be thinking about. I actually personally had an incident where I've had a tenant in a property for 10 years. They wanted to get a dog. They're a family of 5 now, whereas they were just the 2 of them when they first moved in. And the property is big enough for 5, just. I would argue that it's possibly not big enough for a dog as well. But there have been long-term tenants, they've looked after the property, and so therefore we agreed that they could have a dog. And I just stipulated that it should be under a certain weight so that it was reasonable for the property and reasonable for the scenario, and also reasonable in terms of what demands that may put on the neighbourhood. So obviously, arguably a smaller dog is going to make less noise than a bigger dog, potentially. But I also considered that the mother of the partnership is a stay-at-home mum, so it's not like she's going out to work every day and locking the dog in the house. So that's a consideration as well. So kind of all these things, you just need to weigh up the situation. Every single case is going to be different. And in the end, we decided that as long as they were happy to have pet insurance policy to cover any potential damage that the dog may do to the property if they needed to claim or whatever, and that we felt that they were responsible, etc., then, on balance, permission was granted, let's say. Whereas in other cases, like as mentioned in a flat, some leasehold flats, for example, the actual covenant within the lease will actually say that you're not allowed to have pets in the property.
Right.
And that's a lease covenant as opposed to it being a landlord decision. So landlords should definitely check their leases on their on leasehold properties to make sure that there aren't clauses in there like that. And that's typically put in place because of noise issues, I would imagine.
Yeah, really good point. I had a tenant who decided to get a dog and didn't tell me that they were getting a pet. So it was, I used to self-manage the property many years ago and did an inspection. And welcoming me at the door was not only the tenant, but also a dog. And I'm actually a massive dog lover, so I was actually okay with it. Became very comfortable with it very quickly. But I think that you, as you said, Mark, you consider the whole thing, everything together. So the tenant was fantastic. They took good care of the place. I was convinced that with or without a dog, actually, the tenant was very house proud, treated the place as their own home. I didn't think that it particularly increased the risk of damage to the property in any way, which of course it's your property, it's an asset, you want to be thinking about that. So I had no issue with it at all. And ultimately, if a tenant's going to go and get a dog and not tell you, what are you really going to do at that point anyway? It's better to be amicable and find a way of working together on it.
And I guess it sounds like it was a genuine mistake. They didn't necessarily think that they needed permission, and so therefore that was probably a conversation you had with them. And I think just the other thing to say, I mean, in terms of my tenant that I use as an example where I've allowed them to have the pet, it does strengthen your relationship with them and strengthen potentially the length of the tenancy, because it means that if you're prepared to let them have a pet, and whereas the next landlord or agency may refuse to let them have a pet, there's possibly more chance of them staying longer in your property. I would just say that it might be worth, if they get the pet and it is a dog or cat, I say would probably, over the next 18 months, I would probably increase the inspection visits just to make sure everything's going okay, just to monitor it. Don't just turn a blind eye to it, make sure that you're on top of it. I would say that's probably a good policy. But other than that, with all these things, I think that's partly why the policy is in place where it says you can't unreasonably withhold permission or consent to have the pet. I think that's basically covering themselves in the sense that if it isn't a practical solution or a practical option for someone to have a pet, then you're within your right to basically explain why and say this isn't suitable or isn't a suitable property. So therefore, if you want to leave and find somewhere else where it is suitable, then you've got your right to do that and make that clear for the tenant. So we hope that you found that insightful. And we look forward to seeing you on the next video.
See you next time.